My name is Solveig Klein. I am 31 years old. 3 weeks ago, my mother rang the doorbell of the small house my wife and I bought outside Minneapolis. It was a Saturday morning in March. I had not seen my mother in 7 years. The last time I had heard her voice was the afternoon I had come out to her and my father on the back porch of our family home, when I had been 24 and they had told me to leave their house and not come back until I had decided to stop performing this lifestyle. My wife Anika answered the door. I was upstairs giving our 6-month-old daughter Linnea her morning bottle. I heard the doorbell. I heard the door open. I heard a voice I had not heard in 7 years say my wife's name, which my mother had only learned 3 months earlier because she had read about Linnea's adoption in a small post one of my cousins had made on social media. My mother was on the porch in a small navy coat, holding a small white gift bag. She was crying. She told my wife she was here to see her granddaughter. But here's what my mother did not know. I had been preparing for the day she would eventually show up at our door for almost 4 years. And what I said to her that morning, on our front porch with my wife standing between us and my daughter upstairs in her crib, was the result of 3 years of careful thinking, 6 months of formal conversation with a small family therapist who specialized in estrangement, and a single page of conditions that my wife and I had agreed on together that we had been keeping in a small folder by the front door for the previous 18 months. Before I take you back, take a second to like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from right now and what time it is. I love reading those. Now let me take you back to the afternoon I was 24, because that is where this started. I grew up in a small town in southern Minnesota in a small German Lutheran family that had been in the same key for 4 generations. My father was a small dairy farm owner. My mother was a stay-at-home mother who ran the small bookkeeping for the farm and the household. I had one older sister named Margit and one younger brother named Otto. We had been raised in the small, careful Lutheran church my great-grandparents had helped build in 1924. We had been raised to be respectful, hardworking, modest, and traditional in every observable way. I had known I was gay since I had been about 14. I had not told anybody for 10 years. The not telling had been the central organizing principle of my adolescence and young adulthood. I had been a small, careful daughter who had kept the secret because I had been afraid of what would happen if I had not. I had been afraid for a specific reason. My parents had a particular way of talking about gay people that had been the small background noise of my entire childhood. The talk had not been violent. The talk had been polite. The talk had been the kind of small, dismissive religious talk that does not announce itself as hostile, but that communicates very clearly that certain people are not welcome in certain communities and certain families. I had been listening to the talk for years. I had been understanding, in the small, careful way children understand these things, that the talk had been about me even though nobody at the dinner table had known it was about me. I had decided to come out to my parents on a Sunday afternoon in May when I had been 24. I had been finishing my 3rd year of architecture school. I had been living in Minneapolis. I had been in a small relationship with a woman named Renee, who was now my ex-girlfriend, but who at the time had been the first person I had been brave enough to love openly. Renee had been gentle. Renee had told me I should tell my family when I was ready. Renee had told me she would be there for me regardless of how it went. I had driven down to my parents' farm on the Sunday morning. I had been carrying, in the small, careful way some daughters freak things on the drive home, a small specific plan for how I had wanted the conversation to go. I had been planning to tell them honestly. I had been planning to ask for their patience as they processed it. I had been planning to give them time. The conversation had happened on the small back porch of the farmhouse, after lunch. My sister Margit had been there too, because she had been visiting from her own house in town. My brother Otto had been at a small church youth event and had not been home. I had asked my parents if I could talk to them about something. My mother had set down her small coffee. My father had set down his small newspaper. The 3 of us had sat at the small porch table. Margit had been on the porch swing about 6 feet away. I had told them in the small, careful way I had been planning. I had told them I was gay. I had told them I had known for a long time. I had told them I had been in a relationship with a woman named Renee for the previous 8 months. I had told them I had been hoping they would receive the news with the patience I had been needing them to receive it with. My mother had not spoken for a long moment. My father had stood up. He had walked to the small railing of the porch. He had stood with his back to me. He had said, without turning around, "Solveig, I want you to leave. I want you to leave this farm. I want you to leave this family. I do not want to see you again until you have decided to stop performing this lifestyle. Your mother does not want to see you either. Margit, get her things from her old room. She does not need to go upstairs. My mother had not corrected him. My mother had been crying, but my mother had been the kind of woman who had built her entire adult life around supporting whatever my father had decided. My mother had not said anything. My mother had just sat at the small porch table and cried. Margit had been the most painful part. Margit had not said anything either. Margit had stood up from the porch swing. Margit had walked into the house. Margit had gotten the small overnight bag from my old room. Margit had brought it back out to the porch. Margit had set it down at my feet without looking at me. Margit had walked back into the house and had closed the screen door behind her. I had stood up. I had picked up the bag. I had walked off the porch. I had gotten into my car. I had driven back to Minneapolis. I had not cried until I had been in my apartment with Renate that evening. I had cried for almost 3 hours that first night. I had not been crying again in that specific way since. The silence had started that afternoon. The silence had lasted 7 years. I want to tell you what the 7 years had been like, because the 7 years had been the foundation of everything that mattered. The first year had been the hardest. I had been 24 and 25 during that year. I had been trying to finish architecture school while processing the loss of my entire family in a single afternoon. I had been seeing a small therapist named Dr. Merritt Halvorsen, who had specialized in family of origin work and who had become the small, steady presence I had been needing to get through the first year. Dr. Halvorsen had taught me the small, specific framework that had eventually shaped everything that followed. She had told me, in our third session, that the loss of a family of origin was a grief that did not work the way other griefs worked. She had told me it was a grief that came back in waves throughout a person's life, that it was particularly bad at major life moments like graduations and engagements and the birth of children, and that the only thing that helped was building a new framework for what family was going to mean to me going forward. I had built the framework slowly. Renate had been part of it for a while. Renate and I had broken up amicably about 18 months after my coming out, when we had realized we had been more committed to each other through the trauma than through the actual long-term compatibility. I had been single for almost 2 years after that. I had been finishing school and starting my first job at a small architectural firm in Minneapolis. I had been doing the small, careful work of building a life that did not require my family's approval. I had met my wife, Annika, when I had been 28. We had been at a small fundraiser for a community housing project that her law firm had been representing pro bono. We had ended up talking for 3 hours that night. Annika was 32 at the time. She was a small, specific kind of person. She was direct. She was kind. She was the kind of woman who had decided very early in our relationship that she had been in this for the long term and who had told me so within about 3 months of our first date. I had not been used to anybody telling me anything that clearly. I had been a little startled by it. I had also been, in a small, specific way I had not been expecting, deeply grateful for it. We had moved in together after a year. We had gotten engaged after 2. We had been married in a small ceremony at a community center in Minneapolis, attended by about 40 people, almost none of whom were related to me by blood, 3 months before my 29th birthday. The 40 people had been my chosen family, my friends from college, my friends from work, Annika's family who had welcomed me from the beginning and who had made the small, specific effort to be the parents to me that my own parents had not been willing to be. Dr. Halvorsen had been there. Renate had been there too. In the small, generous way, ex-girlfriends sometimes show up to support each other through important moments. My family of origin had not been there. They had not been invited. The invitations had not gone out to them. By the time of my wedding, I had not spoken to anybody in my biological family in 5.5 years. I want to tell you what had been happening in my biological family during those years, in the way I had been able to learn about it from the small distance I had been keeping. I had been hearing small pieces of news through a few cousins on my mother's side who had quietly maintained contact with me. The cousins had been the small lifeline I had not been expecting. They had been the family members who had not agreed with what my parents had done. They had been calling me in small, careful ways every few months. They had been telling me small things. Margit had gotten married 3 years after my coming out. I had not been invited. Otto had finished college and had gone into seminary. I had not been told. My father had been diagnosed with diabetes. I had heard about it about a year after the diagnosis. My mother had taken over more of the farm bookkeeping. I had been informed about this in a small offhand comment from a cousin. I had also been told by one specific cousin named Liesel that my mother had been struggling with the estrangement. Liesel had told me my mother had been talking about me in private to a few close family members. Liesel had told me my mother had been crying about it. Liesel had told me my mother had been wanting, at various points, fix to reach out and had not been able to bring herself to do it because my father had been opposed to any contact. I had appreciated Liesel telling me. I had not done anything with the information. I had been understanding in the small clarifying way these things work that my mother's private feelings were not actionable on my part. My mother's private feelings were her own work to handle. If my mother had been wanting a relationship with me, the work of building one had been hers to initiate. The not initiating was the answer. The crying in private was not the answer. I had been preparing for the possibility that one of my parents would eventually try to reach out. Dr. Halverson and I had been talking about it in our small, ongoing therapy sessions, which had continued throughout the 7 years at a reduced frequency. Dr. Halverson had been telling me, for years, that estranged family members usually did reach out eventually, often at major life milestones, and that the reaching out usually had specific features that I should be prepared to recognize. The reaching out, Dr. Halverson had told me, usually came with an emotional appeal rather than an acknowledgement of what had happened. The estranged parent usually arrived with tears, with regret, with a request for re-entry into the relationship. The estranged parent usually did not arrive with a specific acknowledgement of what they had done, a specific apology for the harm they had caused, or a specific plan for how they were going to be different going forward. The reaching out was usually emotional rather than structural. The reaching out was usually about the estranged parent's grief rather than about repair of the underlying problem. Dr. Halverson had told me, in one specific session about 4 years into the estrangement, that I should think carefully about what conditions I would require before I would let anybody back into a meaningful position in my life. She had told me that the moment the reaching out happened was usually not a good moment to figure out the conditions in real time. She had told me to write the conditions down in advance, to keep them somewhere accessible, and to consult them when the moment finally arrived. Annika and I had spent about 6 months working on the conditions. We had been engaged at the time. We had been thinking about what kind of family we wanted to build together. We had been talking about whether we wanted children. We had eventually decided we did. We had decided that adoption was the path we wanted to take, in part because of small practical reasons, and in part because of a deeper feeling we had both had about wanting to provide a home to a child who needed one. The conditions we had written together had been 4 pages long. The conditions had been specific. The conditions had been honest. The conditions had not been punitive. The conditions had been the small, careful summary of what we would require from anybody in my biological family who wanted to be in any kind of meaningful relationship with us, and especially with any children we eventually had. The conditions had been in a small folder by the front door of the new house we had bought 18 months ago. The folder had been there in case the moment ever came. Linnea had been placed with us as a foster-to-adopt placement at 3 months old, 8 months ago. She was a small, calm baby with dark hair and serious eyes. The adoption had been finalized at her 6-month birthday. About a month before the Saturday morning, my mother had rung our doorbell. Annika and I had been deliriously happy. We had been exhausted, and we had been deliriously happy. I had not told my biological family about any of it. I had not told them about the foster placement. I had not told them about the adoption. The decision not to tell them had been deliberate. They had not been part of my life for 7 years. They had not earned the right to be informed about the small private milestones of the life I had been building. A small cousin had apparently posted something on social media about Linnea's arrival in our family a few months after the foster placement. The post had been kind. The post had been the small public acknowledgement that I had finally become a mother. The post had been seen by my mother, who had apparently been quietly monitoring social media for years for any news about me. My mother had spent the previous 3 months, according to what I had been able to piece together from Liesel after the fact, in a small private crisis about what to do. She had not told my father about the post. She had not told my sister. She had been carrying the knowledge of Linnea's existence alone. She had been crying about it, almost daily. She had eventually decided to come. She had driven the 3 hours from the farm to our house on her own. My father had not known she was coming. She had told him she was visiting her sister in Wisconsin. She had been wearing the small navy coat she had been wearing for special occasions for about 30 years. She had brought a small white gift bag from a small baby store she had stopped at on the way. The bag had contained a small handmade quilt that she had been working on for the previous 2 months, in secret, in the small sewing room at the farm where my father had rarely gone. Annika had answered the door. Annika had been brilliant. Annika had told my mother, in the small, calm voice Annika used in her own legal work when she had been managing high-emotion situations, that she was going to ask me to come downstairs, and that my mother should wait on the porch. Annika had closed the door, not hastily but firmly. Annika had walked upstairs. Annika had told me what was happening. I had handed Linnea to Annika. Annika had taken her into our bedroom. I had walked downstairs. I had picked up the small folder from the table by the front door. I had stepped out onto the porch. My mother had been standing in front of the door with a small gift bag in her hands. She had been crying. She had been the smallest version of my mother I had ever seen. She had looked at me for a long moment. She had said, "Solveig, I am here. I am sorry. I have been sorry for 7 years. I want to be in my granddaughter's life. I have been carrying this for months. I am here. Please." I want to tell you what I felt standing on that porch, looking at my mother for the first time in 7 years. It was not anger. The anger had burned out about year 3. It was not relief. The relief had been replaced, years ago, by a different feeling. It was something quieter than either of those. It was the small, clear recognition that the moment Dr. Halverson had been preparing me for had finally arrived, and that the preparation had been correct, and that I had a specific job to do in the next several minutes. I had pulled the small folder out from behind my back. I had set it on the small porch table. I had sat down at the table. I had gestured for my mother to sit across from me. She had sat. I had said, "Mom, I am going to talk to you for the next several minutes. I want you to listen all the way through before you respond. Can you do that?" She had nodded. She had been still crying quietly. I had said, "I want to tell you what is going to happen today. I am not going to bring Linnea down. I am not going to let you meet her today. I want you to understand that this is not because I am punishing you. This is because the way you have come here today is not the way somebody comes back into a family they were exiled from. You have come here with grief. You have come here with regret. You have come here with a small white gift bag. You have not come here with the specific acknowledgments that would be necessary to begin the kind of relationship you are asking for. I am going to explain what those acknowledgments are. They are in this folder. I am going to walk you through them. You are going to take the folder home with you. You are going to read it. You are going to think about it. If you decide you can do what is in the folder, you are going to come back with my father, and the 3 of us are going to have a different kind of conversation. If you decide you cannot do what is in the folder, you will not be coming back. The decision is yours. The decision is not mine to make for you. I am only telling you what the structure is. She had been silent. She had been listening. I had opened the folder. I had walked her through it. The first condition had been an acknowledgement. The acknowledgement had to be specific. It had to name what had happened on the back porch of the farmhouse 7 years ago. It had to name the words my father had used. It had to name the silence of my mother. It had to name the 7 years of no contact. The acknowledgement could not be a general apology. It had to be the small, specific summary of what had been done. The acknowledgement had to be in writing. It had to be signed by both of my parents. It had to be delivered to me in a small letter that I could keep. The second condition had been about my father. My father would need to be part of any future relationship. My mother could not be a one-side reconciliation. If my father was not willing to participate in the work of repair, the work could not happen. I was not going to be in a relationship with a mother who was visiting me in secret while continuing to live with a man who had thrown me out of my own family. The 2 of them had done this together. The 2 of them would need to repair it together, or there would be no repair. The third condition had been about my wife. Annika was my family. Annika was the woman I had married. Annika was the co-parent of my daughter. Any acknowledgement, any apology, any future relationship would need to explicitly include Annika. My mother could not come to my house and embrace my daughter while continuing to treat my wife as a small inconvenience to be politely ignored. Annika was a full and equal member of our family, and any relationship with my biological family would need to begin with that recognition. The fourth condition had been about Linnea. Linnea was our daughter. Linnea was not a small specific replacement for the relationship my biological family had lost with me. My mother could not show up, wanting to be a grandmother as a way of skipping over the work she would need to do to be a mother again to me. The grandmother relationship was downstream of the mother-daughter relationship. The mother-daughter relationship had to be repaired first. Linnea would meet her biological grandmother only after my mother had done the work of becoming somebody Linnea would be safe to meet. The fifth and final condition had been about ongoing engagement. If my mother and father did the work and re-entered my life, they would need to do it on the terms my family had established. We would not be going down to the farm for holidays. We would not be subject to my parents' small religious framework about how families were supposed to look. We would not be hiding who we were to make my parents comfortable. The relationship would happen in our home, on our terms, in ways that respected the family Annika and I had built. If that was not possible, the relationship would not be possible. I had walked my mother through all 5 conditions slowly. I had not been emotional during the walkthrough. I had been the calmest version of myself I had ever been. The 7 years of preparation had landed in me as a kind of clarity. I had not needed to defend the conditions. The conditions had been right. The conditions had been the small, careful work of 2 adult women who had decided in advance what they would require to let damaged family members back into their lives. My mother had been silent through the entire walkthrough. She had been crying steadily. She had been listening. When I had finished, I had handed her the folder. I had said, "Mom, this is yours. Take it home, read it, talk to Dad. Decide what you are going to do. If you decide to do the work, call me. If you decide not to, do not call me. Either is okay. The choice is yours. I love you. I am not going to hug you today. The hugging comes after the work. Goodbye for now." My mother had stood up. She had been holding the folder. She had been holding the small white gift bag. She had looked at me one more time. She had said, in a voice that had been smaller than the voice she had used at the beginning of the conversation, Solveig, "I am going to read this. I am going to talk to your father. I am going to come back. I promise." I had told her not to make promises she had not yet earned the right to make. I had told her to just go home and read. She had nodded. She had walked off the porch. She had gotten into her small car. She had driven away. I had walked back into the house. Annika had been at the top of the stairs holding Linnea. I had walked up the stairs. The 3 of us had sat on the floor of the upstairs hallway for almost an hour, holding each other. I want to tell you what has happened in the 3 weeks since. My mother had taken the folder home. She had read it carefully. She had given it to my father. The conversation between the 2 of them, according to what I have been told by Liesel, who had been informed by my mother about what had happened, had been one of the worst conversations of their marriage. My father had initially refused. My father had told my mother that no daughter of his was going to dictate conditions for being in the family. My father had told my mother she should never have gone to see me. My father had told my mother she had betrayed him by going. My mother had done something she had not done in 43 years of marriage. My mother had pushed back. My mother had told my father that she had been wrong to support him on the back porch 7 years ago. My mother had told my father that she had been carrying the weight of what they had done for 7 years. My mother had told my father that he could do whatever he wanted, but that she was going to do the work that was in the folder, and that if he refused to do it with her, she would consider what that meant for their marriage. My father had been startled. My father had not known what to do with the version of my mother who had been pushing back. My father had agreed, after several days, to think about it. A week later, my mother had called me. She had told me they had been working on the written acknowledgement. She had told me it was taking longer than she had expected because they had been getting it wrong on the first several drafts. She had told me she had been working with a small pastor at our church who had agreed to help them write it properly. She had told me she did not want to send it until it was right. She had asked for time. I had told her she could take all the time she needed. I had told her I was not in a hurry. The letter had arrived in the mail 2 days ago. The letter had been 5 pages long. The letter had been signed by both of my parents. The letter had named, in specific terms, what they had done 7 years ago. The letter had named the words my father had used on the porch. The letter had named the silence of my mother. The letter had named the 7 years. The letter had acknowledged Annika by name. The letter had apologized for my wedding, which they had not been invited to and which they had not acknowledged in any way at the time. The letter had said they had been wrong. The letter had not asked for anything in return. The letter had ended with a small, specific sentence that had been the part I had not been expecting. The sentence had said, "We are not asking you to forgive us. We are asking you to let us begin the work of becoming the parents we should have been. The pace of that work is yours to set. We are here when you are ready." I had read the letter 4 times. I had cried, finally, in a way I had not cried about my family in years. I had called my mother yesterday morning. I had told her I had received the letter. I had told her it was a good letter. I had told her I was going to invite her and my father to come to our house in 3 weeks for a small, careful first conversation with Annika present and with Dr. Halverson attending via video call to help us navigate the conversation. I had told her Linnea would not be at this first meeting. Linnea would be staying with Annika's parents for the afternoon. The first conversation would be the 3 of us, with the professional help we needed, beginning the slow work of figuring out whether a real relationship was possible. My mother had agreed. She had been crying again, but in a different way than she had been crying on the porch. She had been crying with what sounded like hope. The meeting is scheduled for next month. I do not know how it is going to go. I do not know whether my parents are capable of doing the work. I do not know whether the work, even if they do it well, will result in a real relationship, or whether the damage of the 7 years is too deep to fully repair. What I know is that the structure is in place for the work to begin, that my conditions have been met at the first level, and that whatever happens going forward will happen on terms that protect my family from being damaged again. Annika and I have been talking in the past 3 weeks about how to think about all of this. We have been good at it. We have been making decisions together. We have been clear with each other about what we want. We have been the kind of partners I had not been able to imagine I would ever have. On the back porch in southern Minnesota when I had been 24 and my father had been telling me to leave. Linnea has been Linnea. She is since 6 years old. She does not know any of this. She knows that she has 2 mothers who love her very much. She will know more, eventually, when she is old enough. Annika and I have already started thinking about how we want to tell her the story of her family. The story will be honest. The story will include the truth that her biological grandparents were not part of her early life because of decisions they made before she was born. The story will also include, if my parents do the work, the truth that adults sometimes change, and that her grandparents eventually became people who were able to love her the way she deserved to be loved. I want to tell you what I have learned, because the learning has been the work of the previous 7 years and especially of the previous 3 weeks. The first thing I have learned is that the silence of a parent who claims to love you is often more damaging than the words of a parent who openly rejects you. My father had openly rejected me on the porch 7 years ago. The rejection had been clear. I had known where I stood with him. My mother had been silent. The silence had been worse. The silence had been the small daily ambiguity of not knowing whether she had agreed with him or had simply been afraid to contradict him or had been carrying her own private grief that she had not been brave enough to act on. The silence had been 7 years of small unanswered questions about whether the mother I had grown up with had actually been on my side or had been with my father all along. The silence had finally been broken 3 weeks ago. The breaking had been one of the most important moments of my life. If you have a parent who has been silent during a family conflict, please understand that the silence is its own form of betrayal. The silence is not neutral. The silence is a choice. The silence is the small daily participation in whatever the louder parent is doing. The breaking of the silence is sometimes the only way the silent parent can begin to repair the harm they have done by staying silent. If your silent parent has been wanting to break their silence for years, please consider that the breaking has to come from them. You cannot make them do it. You can only wait and live your life and be ready to receive the breaking if it comes. The second thing I have learned is that the conditions you set for letting damaged family back into your life are the most important administrative work you will ever do for your own future. I had been carrying the conditions in a folder for 18 months before my mother had arrived. The conditions had been written carefully. The conditions had been refined over 6 months of conversation with my wife and with my therapist. The conditions had been ready when the moment had come. The readiness had been everything. If I had been trying to figure out the conditions in real time, on the porch, with my mother crying in front of me, I would have gotten them wrong. I would have either been too lenient because I would have been swept up in the emotion of the moment, or I would have been too harsh because I would have been protecting myself against being swept up in the emotion. The advanced preparation had given me access to the version of myself who could think clearly about what was actually needed, without being subject to the small specific manipulation that estranged family members sometimes engage in when they finally show up wanting back in. If you have estranged family who may eventually try to return, please write your conditions now. Write them in a quiet moment. Write them with the help of a partner or a therapist if you have one. Keep them somewhere accessible. Read them every 6 months to make sure they still reflect what you actually want. When the moment comes, the writing will be ready. The readiness will protect you in a way nothing else can. The third thing I have learned, and the last one I want to give to you, is that grandchildren are not a reset button on the relationship between adults. My mother had arrived at our porch wanting to be a grandmother because the existence of Linnea had finally given her a small emotional opening that she had been waiting for. The opening had been real. The opening had also not been earned. My mother had not done any of the work of repairing the mother-daughter relationship before she had shown up wanting the grandmother-granddaughter relationship. The grandmother relationship cannot exist before the mother relationship has been repaired. The grandmother relationship is downstream of the mother relationship. You cannot skip the upstream work by showing up wanting downstream access. If you have an estranged parent who eventually shows up wanting to be a grandparent to your children, please understand that the showing up is often a small specific attempt to skip the work of repairing the underlying damage by jumping straight to the relationship that the estranged parent finds more emotionally accessible. The skipping is not allowed. The work has to be done in order, mother first, then grandmother. If your estranged parent is not willing to do the mother work, they cannot have the grandmother access. Your children deserve grandparents who have earned the right to be in their lives. Your children do not deserve to be the bridge by which damaged family members re-enter your life on terms that have not been examined. Protect your children. Protect them from being instrumentalized for the emotional needs of the people who hurt you. The protecting is the small, specific work of being a parent. The work is the inheritance you are building. The work is what will let your children grow up safe in a family that has been carefully constructed on the other side of the family that fell apart by adults who had decided that they would never let what happened to them happen to their children. Before you go, tell me something in the comments. Tell me about a moment when a family member who had hurt you eventually tried to come back into your life. Tell me what they said when they tried. Tell me whether they did the work of acknowledging what they had done, or whether they showed up with tears and a gift bag and an expectation of immediate forgiveness. Tell me what you did. Tell me what you wish you had known to do if you could go back and handle it differently. There are more of us than the families who damaged us would ever guess. We have been doing the careful work in small folders and in long therapy sessions for years. Tell me yours. I will be reading every single comment. I will see you in the next one.